Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Wheen. I'm a paediatric physiotherapist. I've been working with children with difficulties with their tone for coming up to 20 years now. I run my own physio practice, but I'm also the CEO of Gympanzees. And today we're going to talk about high tone and how you can help with it at home. So, what is high tone? Tone basically is the resistance to movement in your body. So if you were to take my arm and try and move it, and I'm not trying to resist you and I'm not trying to help you, there will still be some resistance there. Whereas if you took the arm of a rag doll, there'd be absolutely no resistance. It would flop all over the place. So that resistance really is tone. So high tone is where there is just too much resistance. So I'm trying to move this arm and it's just resisting, it's stopping me doing it. Sometimes I can still go, but it just feels like it's a little bit harder than it should be. Low tone, hypotonia on the other side, is when there's not enough resistance. That's when it kind of flops around a lot. And a lot of children will have a bit of both. They may have low tone in their trunk, in their tummies, and high tone in their limbs, or just have high tone in one limb, or in both legs, or just down one side, or the whole body. It is made up of two things. So there's the neural side and the non-neural side. So the neural side is anything coming from the brain, really. It's kind of the nervous system side of it. So basically the messages from the brain are coming down into the muscle and are telling the muscle to work too hard. Now, every joint, so let's say my elbow here, has two sets of muscles around. So it has the muscle on this side, but also the muscle on this side. And when this one is bending the elbow, that is working to get shorter and shorter and shorter at the same time as that one's working to get longer and longer and longer. And they're both working together. It's not that this one tightens and that just goes. They're both actually doing work to do that together. So increased tone is when both of these are both working too hard. So then they're both kind of contracting instead of one releasing while the other one contracts. So they should do this beautiful, one relaxes while the other one, or one gets longer while the other one gets shorter, and it should feel really, really smooth like this. But with these children, it kind of, there's too much, it kind of can, both of them contract. And spasticity is one part of high tone. So spasticity is actually something that's going on in your muscle. And it reacts to a quick stretch. So when you do a quick stretch of the arm, like that, the spasticity kicks in. It's almost like a reflex. So it feels that quick stretch and it hooks on, it makes both muscles completely contract so that it stops you moving and it can almost feel rigid. But then if you go slowly again, you can actually get more movement. And we'll talk about why this is important later. So on the other side is the non-neural side of tone. So this is what's actually happening within the muscle itself or within the joint. So things, for example, like shortening muscles. So if a muscle has got shorter, so say the muscle goes from here to here, and that's got shorter, then that's going to stop you moving through all of this movement, and that's going to make your tone feel higher. There's also, if you're not moving kind of through all your movements all the time, your muscles and soft tissues get a little bit sticky. It's called thixotrophy, and it just means that it's harder, like muscles need to be sliding like this to get longer and shorter. And if it's a bit sticky, it just doesn't quite move quite as well. Or you can get the actual joint itself, which can, it has ligaments, it has loads of different things going on within the joint, and that can all get a bit tight. And all of these together, that plus what's happening from the brain, is all contributes towards a high tone. So when children are born, they don't have any of, none of this non-neural stuff has happened yet because they haven't got used to the way they're moving. So generally when children are born, it's the neural side is much more important than the non-neural side. Whereas if you take a 25-year-old who has been sitting for too long and they have grown an awful lot, they may have a lot of this thixotrophy, a lot of this stickiness, and they may also have some shortened muscles when they haven't been able to stretch. And so the non-neural side for them is an awful lot more important. But we want to really be paying attention to both sides of them the whole way through, rather than concentrate on one or concentrate on the other. So, tone versus strength. Tone and strength are two completely different things, and we all hear it all the time and feel it all the time where you say, my child is so strong, I can't make him move, or he's resisting me so much. And actually, that is the tone at work rather than the strength. So strength is actually how many muscle fibers are within that muscle. So if the muscle is this big, it's how many fibers are in it. And actually, as you do an action and work more than you've done before, it has to be more than you've done before, you get these tiny little bits of damage within your muscle. New muscle comes and fills that in, and the muscle gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger it is, the more muscle fibers there are in here, the more of them can actually pull and contract back in. So that's where strength comes from. It's just the number of muscle fibers. Whereas tone is the brain telling the muscle to work too hard, really. So it's not actually, you can have very weak muscles with very high tone, and vice versa. You can have very low tone muscles but be really, really strong. And strength is really super important for us to be able to do anything. If you're not strong, then the brain will notice that you're not strong, and it makes you feel more vulnerable and makes you feel, because of the weakness, like you're less able to do things, which actually makes your tone go up higher. So the stronger you are, the less your tone has to work. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So what affects our tone? Throughout the day, we all have varying amounts of tone being up and tone being down. So all of us. So me, for example, I'm doing a talk here, I'm sat, I'm not leaning against my chair. So my tone is quite high for me, probably. Whereas last night when I was sitting in the sofa, a glass of wine, watching something nice on TV, I was really relaxed. My tone was really, really low. I was being supported by the sofa. I wasn't having to think much. I wasn't having to do any actions, and so my tone was low. And this is the same for our children. So there will be different things depending on different children, what will make their tone higher and lower. And this can be just an easy way to affect their tone, really. So things that influence tones, two kind of different sides. So there's the outside influences, what's happening to the person, and then the internal factors, how they're feeling. So outside influences, things like how much support you've got. So if you are in that sofa, loads of support, you can kind of sink into that position. Whereas if you're perched, as I am on the end of this chair, there's nothing to hold my body, so I have to keep my tone up because I have to do a bit more work. So this would be the same with your children. So if you're trying to do something like sitting balance with them, if you give them loads and loads of support, they'll just go into that support and kind of sink into your hands, and so they don't have to do as much. They can reduce their tone because you've given them more support. Whereas if you're trying to get them to stand, for example, and you move your hands down their bodies, and suddenly they're having to do an awful lot more for themselves, their tone will go up. And sometimes it'll go way too up, and then they're up on their toes and they've gone a bit rigid, and that's not necessarily helpful. But we can use how much you use your hands to really change how their tone is, so that they're still working, but they've got enough tone to keep them upright, but they don't have so much tone that they can't move, basically. Temperature's another one. A lot of children, when it's really hot, their tone goes down. You know how you feel kind of, whoa, when it's hot. So yeah, a lot of people say, oh, when we went on holiday, it was great. We were able to move. They were so much more flexible and soft. So it may be that actually temperature is something that you can look at. Cold, wind. Have you seen your children in wind? Does that kind of make them a bit more rigid? It can do. How confident they are in their surroundings. So at home, generally, we are more relaxed than we are in a new situation. So going somewhere, going to nursery for the first time, or out in a crowd, or a kind of environment that you're not used to being in, where if you haven't been there before, it's going to make everything kind of more on edge, and tone goes up. The stimulation, so what is coming in from the outside? So if there are lots of loud noises, or if things are feeling like maybe the first time they sit on grass, and grass can really be tickly, and that can completely not be that comfortable, or just because it's new, it can feel quite strange until you kind of get used to the feeling. Maybe what they're seeing, so some children find if it's really, really busy, there's just too much to be looking at, and actually that can increase their tone. And then the big one is gravity. So if you are upright, you are having to balance yourself and work so much harder. So gravity is pushing down on you. So it could want you to go that way or that way. And so your children are having to keep themselves up as much as they can using their tone. Whereas if you're lying down, gravity is just squashing you down, but you don't have to fight against gravity because you're supported. And that's why children can completely relax when they're down. So maybe with some of your children that some of the activities you do in a really comfortable, reclined, supported position, because then their tone goes down and they are more effective, more successful at what they're doing. So the other side, from the internal factors, mood. This can go two ways. So children are angry or really excited, that can make tone go up. If children are feeling relaxed and comfortable and confident, then tone can go down. The excitement one, so it's not necessarily negative moods that make your tone go up. So excitement is a very typical one, or trying to communicate, the effort of trying to communicate can make tone go up in the whole body. If children are well or ill, illness can make tone go down. Not saying that you want your child to be ill, but you may well have noticed that. And then how difficult a task is. If something is really tricky, you're going to make your tone go up because it's affecting your whole body, it's affecting what's going on in your thought process. And so we react by tensing up if something's difficult. You can kind of feel, sometimes you're like, oh, after doing something quite demanding, you realize that actually you've been holding yourself tense, and it's the same for our kids. If it's nice and easy and something that they've done before, then they may have much better tone. Often children with a tonal difficulty or increased tone will have the same kind of pattern. So the very typical pattern for children's upper limbs is like this, and for their lower limbs, bring up my doll, it's that knee goes in, hip turns in, on their toes, bent knees, bent hips. I don't know if you can see that kind of thing. Yeah. So the two legs go in together. And if you are repeating that same pattern, if you're repeating the pattern over and over again, actually that can kind of make you stiff into that position, and that can make your tone go up. So we need to try and change these patterns and give them as much variety as possible. Speed of movement, we've talked about spasticity. Actually, if children are trying to do things fast, that can make their tone go up. Pain and discomfort is a big one. I wonder if you've seen that. Arousal, lack of sleep. If they are really dozy, that can make their tone go down. Or if they're not able to sleep and they're irritable, that can actually make their tone go up. Growth's a big one. Growing weight and height has influences on your tone. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then lack of movement. If they're not moving very much, or they're not motivated to move, then having to suddenly move when they're not used to it can make their tone go up. Right. So as we get older, basically with growth, this is why therapists are involved so much from well, from birth until children are 19, 21, because we're trying to kind of even out the influence of growth. So bones basically will grow like building blocks. So you get older, you have some growth hormones, and new bone comes, and they get bigger and bigger. Doesn't matter if you're on your feet, really. Doesn't matter if you're being very active. Bone will just grow and get longer and longer. They get thicker because of weight bearing. So if you're putting weight through your limbs, that impact that you get, new bone comes in and makes it thicker. But the length of the bone, you can't really do anything about it. Your bone, with nutrition and with time, growth hormone, your bones are just going to get bigger and bigger. Your muscles only grow in length if they're stretched. So as they're stretched, new bits of muscle come in, and then they can get longer and longer and longer, and that's how muscles grow. So if your muscle is being pulled by the increased tone, so let's say I've got increased tone in this one, and so it makes me not want to straighten out my arm, that's fine until my arm starts growing. I'll just demonstrate with this, see if this works. So let's say this is my little leg coming out, and this is my muscle. So this is the hip flexors. It's the bit at the front of my hip that bends my leg up like this. Okay, so let's say my muscle is as long as my finger. As the bone grows, so it's coming out here, basically, if I just pull it here, the muscle's going to come unattached. If the muscle isn't growing because it hasn't been stretched, then the only way the bone can grow is if it goes up and up and up, and you're getting tighter and tighter here because the muscle hasn't gone long enough. If you then stretch the muscle, it can grow and you can keep having that nice movement coming out. So unless we're getting stretching of the muscle, the joints are going to get tighter because the muscles just aren't long enough to make up for the fact that the bones are growing. And this is kind of also the same with if you're putting on weight. If you're putting on weight, your limbs are going to be heavier, and so you need more muscle to be able to do the same amount as action as you did when the limb was lighter. So we need to keep strengthening and keep stretching as these children get older, which is why we need to keep working and keep working and keep working until they stop growing. And at that point, life becomes a little bit easier. So we want to be able to obviously keep as much length and as much strength in our limbs as possible. So stretching. The only way that we're going to keep up with the bones is to stretch these muscles. And you'll go through kind of fits and starts because we're not growing, children aren't growing all the time. They have kind of these growth spurts that you'll notice because they're really hungry, or they suddenly feel really much tighter. Even if they're in a wheelchair or in a buggy and you can't see that they're getting taller, you can often feel it because they're getting tighter and tighter. So there are 3 different ways to stretch. The best way is them doing their own stretching through their own everyday activities. So for example, if I've got this tight elbow here and I reach out for a cup, I am stretching my own elbow here, which is great. And that's the best way. And if it's part of everyday life, then you're gonna, every time I'm stretching this, my bone is growing, but I'm still stretching, and then we don't get tight here. So that's the best. It's not always possible. So if it's not always possible, the next best one, which is still brilliant, is your prolonged stretch. So that means a stretch that's a minimum half hour, hopefully an hour in a day. So I know that sounds an awful lot, but this is why we have the equipment we have, is to try to get this prolonged stretch in as often as we possibly can. Really, that should be 4 or 5 times a week. They've done a lot of research on this, and if you're just doing little bits of stretching, it's just not going to have the same effect. So your prolonged stretch is the one that's actually going to make your muscles longer. So it's the really important one when you're having these growth spurts. So you can kind of, as soon as you start feeling there's a growth spurt, this is when you get back onto the prolonged stretch. And it may last 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, until you've caught up to the bones. And then you can kind of continue with less intensive stretching for a bit. But as long as you're keeping on top of it like that, we'll keep these muscles long enough to deal with the fact that the bones are growing. So you can break this into different times. You can have 2 sessions of half an hour, or 3 of 20 minutes, or 4 of quarter an hour throughout the day. Just, it has to fit into your day, because I know everyone is crazy busy. So it needs to not feel like just having a stretch, just having a stretch, just having a stretch. So things like standing frames. So there are more and more standing frames now which will allow stretching. So if a child is kind of more bent like that, a standing frame, stretching out the front of the hips and stretching out the back of the knees, and also stretching its ankles. So you can have a nice stretch in the standing frame, and then you're not having to do any stretches. The stretching's being done for them. So that's really nice. That doesn't, one of the biggest muscles that gets tight is the hamstring. And hamstring goes from really actually the back of the bottom here to the back of the knee there. So to stretch this, you can't just be like that, because that only goes from there to there. It needs to be like that. And then that muscle is having to go around and all the way to the back. So unless you're like this already, the standing frame is not going to be doing your hamstrings. You need to be having that position to do your hamstrings. And you can feel that when you're trying to do your own stretching. So if you sit on the floor and touch your toes, that's when you're going to get a really lovely hamstring stretch. So long sitting, physios bang on about it. I don't know if you know about gaiters. So gaiters are bits of cloth that you wrap around the legs and you tie on with Velcro, and they have 2 or 3 metal kind of braces down the side just to hold that knee straight, and then you don't have to hold on. They're really comfortable, they're not a problem, but they can just make this a much more effective stretch. So if they're just in that position, they're getting their stretch, they can do that in front of the TV, in front of their screens, doing their homework, anywhere that you can get them to, so they don't realize what they're doing. Is fundamentally, we want to make it as nice for them as possible. The next one is lying on their tummy. You can either do this flat or up over a little wedged cushion, and that's doing another lovely stretch at the front of their hips. This is another place that gets tight, the front of their hips. The other place that gets tight is their ankles and hands, and it may be that you can have a hand splint that they just rest in, or their ankle splints. Don't know if anyone has AFOs or DAFOs, ankle foot orthosis, and they just hold your foot in a really lovely 90-degree angle, which is what we need for standing. And that way they've just got that stretch is happening and you're not doing anything about it. But because children are active, and because if they're in AFOs, they may well be doing some standing. When their tone goes up, they'll want to be up on their toes like this. So the AFOs are on to hold you in a really good position and give you that stretch. Otherwise, they'll spend the day like that. Sleeping systems as well, they can be good for a stretch. A lot of children, if they're tight in between their legs, then the sleeping system can just help them to open their legs like that. So that's, prolonged stretching is really important, and you can lengthen a muscle. So you can get to the end of where a muscle is and make it even longer by having a prolonged stretch. It's a really, really important one to be thinking about. The last one is passive stretching. So passive stretching is when I do my stretches and I'm stretching for the child, and I'm holding them up here for 30 seconds or whatever. I'm stretching their hands, I'm stretching their thumbs, I'm stretching out their elbows. That's all passive stretching because someone is doing that to the child. They're not doing it themselves. So passive stretching, it increases the muscle length. Let's say my elbow, and I stretch it out to here. It will increase that for about 30 minutes and then it will ping back. But it doesn't actually make the muscle longer. It will just keep it at the length that it is. So it's great to prepare you to get a prolonged stretch. So it may be that you stretch out the knees, stretch out the hips, and then go into the standing frame. Or it may be that you stretch out the knees and then put the gaiters around and do a long sitting thing. Or you stretch out the feet a little bit, bit of a stretch on these feet, and then you put the foot splint on, because it will increase the length. It will increase where it is to wherever it will. It just won't make it even longer than what it can do at the moment. So it's great before an activity. So let's say you're trying to do some work with some Play-Doh, and he's got some tight little fingers. It may be that you give the fingers a stretch and then they can play better, for example. But you're not going to change the muscle length. You're not going to make it longer with a passive stretch. That's where you need the prolonged stretch. It's also, some children find it really comfortable to have a passive stretch. It feels really nice, especially if they've been in bed all night and they've got a bit scrunched up, or if they've been in their chair all day. A stretch can feel really nice. In which case, obviously, you want to keep going with them. So what can we do for the actual tone? So that's stretching. So we're working that, all that stretching has been working on the non-neural side of it. For the neural side, it's those environmental factors, the internal and external, that we've talked about before. So things like how much support you give, and the effect of gravity, their mood, their temperature, whether they're ill, all that kind of stuff. So if you go back to that list and have a little think about what works well for your child, and every child is different, they don't all react to things the same. So you need to work out what actually works for your child. So let's say your child is trying to work on fine motor skills. So fine motor skills is where you use all the tiny little muscles in your hands to do a more complicated activity. So it may be holding a pen, or doing a zip, or a button, or just pressing a button, anything using your fingers. It's pretty hard work, so that's quite taxing. So you need your tone to be as good as possible to be able to do this taxing skill. So probably you want to make sure they're well supported in their chair. So it may be that they have, if they have a chest strap, or they have a harness or something that you put on, lots of support in their chair, and then they can just relax in their chair and their tone can go down. You want them to be happy and motivated. If the task is challenging, you want to make it just a little bit more challenging than what they're used to, but they need to be successful in it. If they're not successful, they get annoyed and frustrated, and that could be the end of your task. So you want it to be a little bit challenging, but still engaging. So they still need to want to do it. In other words, they still need to be able to do it. It may be that you've given them that stretch before, and that the room temperature is really good. And then maybe at that point, then they're ready to do their fine motor skill, and they'll be better at doing it. And if they're better at doing it, then their brain and their muscles and their joints are learning, look, I can do it in this way. And so they're kind of changing what's going on in the brain. Instead of learning how to do something wrong, they're learning how to do something right. And you can have a carryover effect by doing things in a better way. So we want their tone to be as good as possible, really, before they learn these new tasks. The second really great way to improve tone is to weight bear. So putting weight through your joint. So the best way to do this is to be on a stretch and then put the weight through. So for my elbow, I would want to then be on my elbow like that. For my knees, I would want to have straight knees and then standing. So you're wanting to have the stretch and then putting weight on it. So one that lots of people like is side sitting. So knees are side sitting. You straighten out that elbow, get that flat hand, and then put their weight on that elbow. And then just putting your weight through a stretched limb reduces the tone. So after they do that, their arm will probably feel a lot better, and they potentially could do different skills up here because they've prepared it down here. Hands and knees is a nice one. So if you can stretch out, if you've stretched out maybe while you're with in side sitting and then get them in their hands and knees. That can be a really nice way to wake there. Standing frame, so some children feel a lot better after they've been in their standing frame. Some children feel better after they've done a bit of a walk. Some children feel better after you've just been standing with them in front of you. So that can really help with their tone. It could be that you prepare them by doing this thing with weight and then you do the action. So it may be that you prepare through standing. So they've had some lovely standing, standing with their straight knees, and then you try and practice the walking rather than just going straight from sitting and then walking, where their tone's going to shoot through the roof. So the next one is something called tone influencing patterns, called TIPs. So our bodies kind of work in whole body patterns. So our arms come in like that, and then they stretch out like that. So instead of each muscle wanting to do its own things, there are some movements that we do so often that it makes sense for them all to have learned how to do something together. So your tone or increased tone will often have worked in those patterns and found some very specific patterns here, and then we had it for your legs as well, didn't we? That it was in, bent, and on your toes there. So a tone influencing pattern is basically the exact opposite pattern from these patterns that our kids take. So for your arm, your tone influencing pattern from there is the exact opposite, which means turning a hand up and reaching up into the sky like this. So anywhere from here to here. So this is kind of holding a tray, even better if I'm back actually. It's holding a tray with my palm upwards, elbow straight, wrist back, thumbs, fingers open. So it's the exact opposite of this kind of scrunched up position, is that big position. Anything here is better than that. So your biggest tone influence pattern, the one that's going to influence the most, is this huge one here. If they can't manage that, then that's better than that. If they can't manage that, then out here is better. All of this is better than that. So we basically are wanting to do as much in their everyday life out here. And if they're going out here, then they're doing their own stretching. They're doing their own strengthening. Everything kind of in a way against the tone. So it kind of is the opposite of where the tone wants to go. For your legs, so our little doll wants to be here, and the tone influencing pattern is the opposite. So the hip turns out, knees straight, feet pointing outwards, and we're going backwards if we can. That is the exact opposite of that. So we're trying to get as much of that in their everyday life as possible. For your trunk, it's actually twisting. So your tone generally means that children stay quite straight here, and we want them to twist in their body. So their shoulders and their hips are doing the opposite. So that's the tone influencing pattern for their bodies. So if you can get your TIPs into their everyday life, this will have a huge influence on their tone. It may not be that you can get the full kind of extreme position, but any of this is going to be helping reduce their tone. So things like, so the pattern that they'll want to do is to be pulling at any equipment. You give them something and they pull it in, whereas we want them to be pushing out. So for any objects that you want them to get, try to pass it up here. They won't take it here, take it all the way here, but you want it away from their body. So just pass that. Every time you pass them something, that's an opportunity for them to be reaching into their TIP, which will be reducing their tone. So their feeding utensils, their screens, if they have an iPad or a phone, their toys, anything you can, get them to reach out here. Same with playing games. If you've got bubbles, instead of kind of making them pop them in front of them, try getting them to pop out towards this TIP again. Pushing games, pushing and pushing out to the side even more, and playing as far away from the body as you possibly can. Use grip because they need to learn grip, but also learning release. Again, that's towards the TIP, that's towards tone. And if you grip with your hand, can you feel that it tightens the whole arm? Whereas if you're releasing, the whole arm should relax a bit. If they have got this big grip and they're not letting go, try stroking the top of their hand, and that can help them open, or bend the wrist down, and that helps them release their fingers. We just want the opposite. Instead of there, want as much as we possibly can there. So it may be things like putting on a jacket. You put, instead of putting the jacket hole here for them to put their arm into, you just put it there for them to put their arm, or up there for them to put their arm in. Or if they are, if you're washing their arm, for example, in the bath, if you say, well, you know, bring your arm up, it could even be that you help them a little bit, take their arm a little bit up, and so they're doing a bit and you're doing a bit if it's too much for them, and then they can wash here instead of washing here. Just trying to keep in your head that this TIP, this position up here, is just where you want to be going as many times as you possibly can during the day. For your legs, it's anything with their knees straight and away from the body, basically. So a lot of children will stand or walk crossing their legs over this way. So we want them to be going that way. So it may be, if they're standing, instead of standing with their feet forward, turn their feet out to the side. Instead of standing with their feet together, try having their legs apart from each other. May even have one leg forward and one leg back. That's even more of a TIP because it's different from what they want to happen. It may be if they are they're standing at furniture, or if they're in a walking frame, that you can get them to kick a ball, and instead of just putting it in front of them, which is what we automatically think of doing, if you can put it out to the side so they have to kick outwards. So just trying to get them to do as much legs straight, legs apart, and legs turning out. If you can backwards, it's quite hard. That's the cherry on the cake, really. In the standing frame, ask your physio whether she can turn the feet out in the standing frame. A lot of them you can move the feet, but rather than being like that, you might as well get one more part of the TIP in there, and you're getting that extra bit of reducing tone. It may be that while they're changing their nappies, that you give them an extra TIP stretch. So while they're there, instead of doing their nappies all tight up here, it may be that you give them a bit of a stretch while they're doing it. And it's the same thing with the arms. If you can't get this huge, massive, beautiful position out here, it may be that you can get it here or here. Just as many different elements as you can of that TIP, which is opposite from their one. And that is us. So those are just some little things. The things to remember is that we need to stretch to maintain what we're doing, and to maintain their movement and to maintain their length until they stop moving, really. Other takeaways is strength. Strengthening is really important. If we can make a limb stronger, then the tone can go down because the tone isn't having to hold on and do the work as much. The TIPs, weight bearing, and changing the environment to actually reduce the neural part of the bone. Okay, so thanks very much for coming along, and I hope you got something from that. And that's it for today. Thank you very much. Goodbye.